I'll start while they're sorting out the technical issues. I've called this talk the gender health gap to mirror the other common gender gap we know about, the gender pay gap. But I'm not really talking about a gender gap, I'm talking about a sex gap. That is a gap between men and women. The Australian government thinks that the gender pay gap is an important enough issue that it's created an agency to deal with it, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency. It probably won't surprise you that the government doesn't think a health gap is an important issue and there is no health equality agency. So just to start with, I want to talk a bit about sex and gender. I've got a graphic here that I'm meant to be showing you of a guy called Bill Nye. I don't know if you know Bill Nye. In the United States he's known as a science guy. And many years ago he made programs that talked about science, including one where he spoke about the science of how gender is determined or how sex is determined in human beings along the line of chromosomes. Recently he's done another show where he's now talking about sex being a continuum from male to female, or a spectrum rather than two discrete points. Netflix went back and removed the chromosomal stuff from his old documentaries, and this is the same Netflix that won't show Cassie Jay's documentary, so one can only assume that they have an agenda. All right, so I don't want to bore you too much with basic biology, but as we should know, sex determination in human beings is related to chromosomes, X and Y chromosomes. Females have two X's, males have an X and a Y. The female always contributes an X chromosome to the new individual, and the male can contribute either an X or a Y, so it's the father who determines the sex of the child. In the lingo we say that chromosomal sex determines gonadal sex. That means whether you have ovaries or testes, and that then determines whether you look externally like a male or a female. One of the most fascinating subjects that you can study as a doctor in training is embryology. This is the science of how two cells unite and grow and develop to make a new human being. And it's interesting, you've probably seen diagrams like this before where we look like creatures that have gills and different things and tails before we actually become a mature human being. So what happens in sexual development is that at about 7 weeks, the developing embryo does not have any differentiation of its sexual characteristics. It's basically a blank. If the Y chromosome is present, there is a gene on that chromosome called the SRY gene that sets off a whole cascade of things that will lead to the development of testes. And if testes develop, obviously testosterone will develop. In the absence of that gene and the cascade of events, the embryo will develop ovaries, and then without testosterone will develop into a female. There are two sets of ducts inside the evolving embryo, and in the male one set is switched off, which becomes the fallopian tubes, uterus and vagina, and in the male another set is set in motion that becomes the vas and the duct. So if you look at human beings at birth, basically half will be easily classified as male or female. There is a small group in the middle there which doesn't define a spectrum, but which is a group of conditions medically we refer to as disorders of sexual development. That's a very important group, and the management of those individuals is important, but they are a very small group. The other aspect that people talk about is gender. when they're not meaning biological sex, they're actually meaning how people identify. So there's the expressions gender expression or gender identity. And, the neo-Marxist feminists have created such a long list of these, it's hard to know how many there are at the moment. I don't know if you've seen the parody that people use now that they identify as an attack helicopter, because it seems to make as much sense as some of these other genders do. This sort of thing is actually infiltrating our schools, in that in Victoria there's a Safe Schools program where they teach all sorts of weird stuff to kids even in primary school. I don't know whether you can read that cartoon from Bill Leake, but basically on the board it says today's lesson is environmentally sustainable penis tucking, and the kid puts his hands up and says, "Sir, I can't read it," and the teacher, who's dressed in regalia, says, "What, don't your parents teach you anything at home?" And of course, if we had to work out the difference in health between 58 or 60 genders, then our minds would probably explode. So, what I'm going to talk about today is the difference between males and females. And look, throughout history, the vast majority of people have no trouble identifying which side of the spectrum they're on. There's always been, men and women will always have some masculine traits and some more feminine traits. We talk about tomboys or we talk about effeminate males, and that's great because that's part of the diversity of human life. Anyway, how do we define health? Health is defined as a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So it's a fairly broad concept, and there are lots of things that determine how healthy we are. So how can we measure health? There are many different ways, but one of the first ways we can look at is life expectancy. And life expectancy is a statistical measure that looks at death rates at a particular point in time and tries to extrapolate how long people would live based on those death rates. Australia does very well in this regard. For males, it's the third highest life expectancy in the world in 2012, and for females, they were number 7. However, even with those rankings, females are living 4 to 5 years longer than males. This is a trend right throughout the world. Average of 5 years, in some places 10 or 15 years difference between males and females in life expectancy. And what you find is the difference between rich developed countries and poor or underdeveloped countries is much greater than between the genders per se. This particularly applies also in Australia. This is a graph of the life expectancy at birth in Australia, and as you can see, the trend is one to improvement, but there is a gap between male and female that has been maintained and is still persisting. Now, the agencies in Australia that report on things to do with health and mortality are the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, and someone down there has a bit of a sense of humour because they called their database the General Record of Incidents of Mortality, which becomes abbreviated to GRIM, so seemed a bit strange. Anyway, what I want to look at is what we call premature mortality. If we just look at why people die and how often they die, it's not overly instructive because eventually everyone has to die of something. But we define premature mortality as deaths occurring before the age of 75. So it used to be 70 was considered a good life. The ABS now thinks 75 is a good life. And if we look at those premature deaths, we can subcategorise them into those that are potentially avoidable versus those that are considered not avoidable. And then we can also look at other factors that might be predisposing. So this is the overall trend in mortality for in premature mortality for men and women in Australia from 1997 through to 2012. And as you can see, there is a downward trend, which is great, and there's a slight narrowing of the gap. If we look at this same data at different age groups, we'll find exactly the same thing. So I'll flick through these graphs and just have a quick look. infants less than 1 year of age, children 1 to 14, 15 to 24, much wider gap there than at some of the other age groups. Adults 25 to 44, 45 to 64, and finally 65 to 74. So at all age groups, men are dying prematurely, significantly more often than women are. If we look at, rather than just the raw rates, the actual diseases and conditions that cause premature mortality, and these are ranked in the order per the whole population. So for the whole Australian population, coronary heart disease is the biggest killer, and the graph on the left there shows a breakdown per age group, and the graph on the right shows the trends over time. So you can see over time the mortality, premature mortality from coronary artery disease has declined after a peak in the 1970s, and that the graphs are coming closer together, so the gap is narrowing. But if you look at the total numbers, which are the bar graphs on the left, you'll notice that men start to die much earlier and they die in much bigger numbers overall. The second in the rank list is lung cancer. Once again, you can see the predominance of men, but it's interesting with this one that the rates are going up for women, and presumably that's because of the increased number of women who started smoking in the 70s, 80s and beyond. So their rate's still climbing but plateauing. The rate for men is coming down but still exceeds the women. Suicide we've already heard about. It's clear from that graph that men outnumber women quite substantively. There's also a peak beyond the 74-year age group of elder men, which isn't covered in this because they're not considered premature deaths. Colorectal cancer, once again, predominance of males, but a slight narrowing of the gap over time. Cerebrovascular disease, this is strokes. They've mirrored each other pretty well, but a slight preponderance of men. Breast cancer does not just affect females. There are male deaths from breast cancer, but the rates are very low. And if you look at this graph, what we find is that women start to die from breast cancer even down into their 30s. So it is a really very significant cause of problems for women, and it causes a lot of life years lost because it can happen at quite an early age. COPD means chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. This is emphysema and lung-related problems, most commonly related to smoking. Once again, you can see a slight climb in the female rate with their increased uptake of smoking and a gradual decline in the male rate, so that they're coming closer together, which is a good thing. Land transport accidents, men significantly outnumber women, but once again the rates are coming down and the graphs are coming closer together. Liver disease has remained pretty steady over the years, but a preponderance of males. Diabetes, these ones did a bit of a crossover in the rates, so that previously women died more frequently prematurely from diabetes, but now men have exceeded them. Accidental poisoning, males predominate once again, and it's important to note that statistics for things like accidental poisoning and motor vehicle accidents are not always accurately reflecting the underlying cause of death, because some of these will actually be suicides. Melanoma, this is my area of particular interest, which is skin cancer, and compared different to all the other graphs we've looked at, we see the rates in melanoma are climbing, and they're climbing more rapidly for men. There are many reasons why this might be the case. They are starting to plateau out a little bit, and that might be related to protective activities and sunscreen use, but that's of concern that there is a major fatal cancer that's causing younger men to lose productive years of life. Prostate cancer, the thing that's different between prostate cancer and breast cancer is that men start to develop it and die of it at a bit of a later age. So it's very uncommon in your 30s and 40s to get breast cancer. It certainly becomes much more common in the 50s, 60s, beyond. And the largest group of men who die from prostate cancer are going to be beyond that 74 years of age. Assault, and this will include domestic assaults, but not all of them. Once again, males simply far outweigh females in the rates of premature death from assault. Accidental drowning, and this is another one that could be suicide related. Men outnumber the women. So if we look at all the premature years of life lost, we find that men account for 63% of the loss, and that's a very significant gap. So what I want to do now is take a bit of a journey along the ages of men. Shakespeare had a famous piece in As You Like It where he described the different ages of men's lives, starting with mewing and puking at the nurse's arms. But I want to go back to sex again before we get on to this. So the ovaries in women start out life with somewhere around 1 million eggs, of which throughout their life maybe 400 or so might ovulate. Men start out with premature testes, which by the time they reach puberty are capable of producing 1,000 to 2,000 sperms per second. That is 40 to some 200 million per day. Now, if you think about where problems might occur with mutations and damage to genetic material, it's probably far more likely it's going to happen on the male side, and males are recognised as being the drivers of evolution. In fact, the whole reason why sexual reproduction in two sexes exists is to aid diversity and to enable evolution. Of those huge numbers of sperm that are produced, many will be abnormal. They'll have two heads or funny shaped heads or tails that don't wiggle. Only the strongest one, hopefully with the best genetic information, is going to make it to cause fertilisation. What we find is that if a ovum is impregnated by a Y-containing sperm, so it becomes a male zygote, it's less likely to survive. So a lot of these will be aborted or will not implant. If you look at pregnancies that abort after 16 weeks, there's a ratio of male fetuses being aborted of 2.4 to 1. Sex selection. It's been common in many places in the world for people to either abort or kill off infants based on their gender, particularly girls in places like China and the Indian subcontinent. That's obviously a problem that needs addressing. But if you look at developed countries where technology now provides a way for people to select the sex of their children, or indeed in adoption statistics, you'll find that people are much more commonly electing to want a girl than a male. Probably one of the most distressing things is that sometimes when an infant is first comes into the world, the first thing that the parents or doctor does is to cut their genitals. And in Australia, this doesn't happen as much as in the United States, but currently Medicare, which is the health insurance system in Australia, will give a doctor $39.55 to circumcise a male infant without anaesthesia. But at the same time, we have a law that prohibits female genital mutilation with a penalty of up to 21 years in prison. Probably one of the most obvious double standards I know of. This is data from Medicare that shows that there's still some 30,000 odd Australian infants and young boys being circumcised each year, so still a significant problem. If we look at the law about prohibiting female genital mutilation, it's interesting that it says that you can operate on the genitals of women who have been through labour and childbirth, if it's done by a doctor for a medical reason. So if a woman goes along and says, I don't like the look of my genitals, can you do something about them? That's okay. But if a woman for cultural reasons goes and asks for her genitals to be altered for a cultural reason, that's not okay. So once again, there's another weird double standard. All right, moving along. Australian boys, as with boys everywhere, for the reasons I tried to outline before about mutation rates and the like, will more frequently suffer from congenital abnormalities in Australia. And for the most common of these, the birth rate of males to females is about 105 to 100. But for the most common congenital abnormalities, the rates of boys are about up to 120 to 100. These are some chemicals that are referred to as endocrine disruptors, and endocrine disruptors are a class of chemical that includes things like BPA, which you've probably heard of in plastics, a group of things called phthalates, which are used also in plastics, some pesticides and some naturally occurring hormones that are in plant material, particularly soy and those types of things. And also the use of growth-enhancing agents and hormones to increase yields in livestock. All of these things can lead to feminisation of the male infant, and in girls to premature onset of menstruation. This is potentially a major problem, and it's one that Warren Farrell intends to address in his upcoming book about the boy crisis. If we look at social norms for young boys, we find that society has long dictated a harsher treatment for them. So you find that male infants are picked up when they're crying, not as quickly as female infants are. Punishment tends to be harsher. They're spanked more often. And if you look at the rates of child abuse, you'll find that male children are more commonly the victims of physical abuse, emotional abuse and neglect, whereas female children tend to be more commonly the victims of sexual abuse. Neurodevelopmental disorders tend to follow a distribution that's different from the average distribution. A lot of you will be familiar with this graph, which came from a large study in Scotland way back in 1932, where they looked at the intelligence of a large group of children and found that with men they were more on both extremes, so more very bright versus more intellectually handicapped boys versus a congregation of women in the middle zone. Down in Victoria, they've started some education issues where even as young as kindergarten children, they want to stop them from selecting toys that interest them, that are gender-based or sex-based toys, or behaviours that they consider are more boyish. And down in the Feminist Republic of Victoria, this program is to the stage where they're now teaching the preschool teachers how to do it. Boys suffer more commonly from disorders such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and this is a condition that's diagnosis has become much more frequent in recent years, and the frequent response to it is to give kids drugs so that they will behave, basically. But many consider that this is just, a lot of it is just natural boyish behaviour that teachers or parents figure they can't deal with, mainly because they've been probably through the media, brought to believe that boys should be, and children in general, should be perfect, which of course they're not. We also find that mental health disorders are more prominent in children and adolescents. So data from the ABS shows that for the previous 12 months, 16% of males overall in the ages 4 to 17 versus 11.5% of females in that same age bracket suffered from some type of mental health issue. Adolescence we know to be a time where boys indulge in more likely in risky behaviour and experimentation, risk-taking and the like. And this leads to an increase in deaths from automobile accidents, assault, drownings, drug-related crimes and the like. In Australia, the drug and alcohol-fuelled violence issue is very prominent at the moment. There's been quite a number of highly publicised one-punch deaths, and some of the states have brought in legislation to combat this, and this is certainly something that needs attention. We tend to think of body image issues as mainly a girl's problem or a female problem, but indeed boys suffer from body image issues probably as frequently as girls. Whereas girls want to be slim, boys want to bulk up. They're inclined to overtrain at the gym, use supplements, and ultimately get into anabolic steroids and the like. Other issues that are prominent in adolescent boys are video game addiction and porn addiction. And I'm repeating stuff that's come out already several times in this, and that's mainly because the health umbrella brings it all together. Sport. Australians are mad keen on their sport. I'm not a big footy fan, but given that our local team won the grand final last year, we all got a bit excited about that. But sport basically over time has used men's bodies as a way of entertainment, even as far back as the gladiators in Rome. And they pay a significant price for providing that entertainment. They suffer injuries and disability. Some athletes die suddenly on the field. If that's going to happen, it's 5 times more likely to be a male that dies from some undiagnosed cardiac problem. Contact sports, we're increasingly recognising, cause acquired brain injuries, and these have their own problems associated with them. Investigation of this is very big in the States at the moment with the football leagues there. The research is showing that women who play contact sports are actually more predisposed to brain injury than men, yet the trend is for women to more frequently participate in things like mixed martial arts and contact rugby and the like. All right, we all know that workplace deaths are predominantly male. The situation in Australia is no different than elsewhere. 96% of them were male in 2015. The good news is that overall workplace deaths are on the decline. The not so good news is that there are workplace-related deaths that don't really get factored into the equation. So a lot of men will die years after their exposure to hazardous materials in work. That's not factored in because they come at a later stage and they're attributed to the primary cause. So an example would be mesothelioma, which is a cancer related to asbestos exposure. Those of us in Queensland will know that recently there's been a resurgence of black lung, which is a condition that affects coal miners. And even things like melanoma, which are due to UV exposure, can occur years after that exposure occurred in the workplace. When the death rate is just the tip of the iceberg as well. If you actually look at the disability and morbidity that's suffered following non-fatal injuries at work, you'll find that about 70% of that burden is suffered by males. Which brings me to the concept of burden of disease. Burden of disease is a statistical concept that looks at how diseases affect people either by dying younger than they should or how they impact on their life and ability to live normally. When they work these things out, they give different weights to different illnesses depending on their impact, and they're measured in a thing called dailies, which are disability adjusted life years. Overall, men at virtually every age group suffer more burden of disease than women do, and 54% of the burden of disease is suffered by men. Men also do suffer from reproductive health problems, so women have their own field of gynecological problems, but men suffer from infertility, penis problems, low testosterone, prostate, sexual disabilities and the like. You find that at least 1 in 3 men over the age of 40 suffers from some sort of reproductive health issue. Just looking at men's health overall in Australia, as I said earlier with the international death rates, some groups are at particular disadvantage. So there's big gaps between higher and lower socio-economic groups, and the people who are worst affected tend to be people in rural and remote areas and of Aboriginal heritage. Other groups include disabled persons, veterans and the like. I could go on and present lots more information about a gap between the genders or the sexes in health, but I think that's enough, and this information all comes from reliable government sources. So the government has known about this for decades but has done nothing, and I think that's just inexcusable really, but that's the way it is. All right, so to move on, we'll just look at what we call the determinants of health. So in close to the person, you've got their genetic makeup and hereditary and susceptibilities and their own psychological makeup. You've got the behaviours they indulge in, which are ostensibly under their control. So, for example, smoking or healthy lifestyle, good diet, activity, alcohol, sexual activity and the like. You then have the community around them and how that facilitates or doesn't facilitate what they might do if they need health advice or develop some problem. And then you've got the much broader socio-cultural environment, which includes things like people's education level, whether they're employed or unemployed, what the government policies are, what services are provided and so on. And these more remote things are referred to as the social determinants of health. A group in Canada drew up a list of some 14 of these, which often have more impact on the possibility of ill health or death than the commonly known ones like smoking, alcohol, overweight, high blood pressure, cholesterol. Okay, so why do we have a gap in health? Because there are a few other gaps. One of the gaps is that there's less funding given to men's health problems. So this was a headline from a couple of years ago. Men die earlier, but women's health gets 4 times more funding. This is a graph of the funding grants from the National Health and Medical Research Council towards female cancers in the blue line versus male cancers in the green line. Certainly a very large disparity. And the disparity is across the board. So if you look at organisations that support women's health, there are many more of those than organisations that support men's health. Charities, there are more women's charities. Services, there are more services. A study in the United States back in 2004 showed that over the lifetime there was 1/3 more spent on the average woman's health than there was on a male's health. All right, the next gap we've got is an education gap. So if you try and find out information about male health, there's much less of it out there than there is about female health. In 2010, the Australian government launched its first national male health policy, and that was a good thing. However, it lagged the introduction of a national female health policy by some 21 years. So it's obviously a problem that they didn't perceive as important over all that time, despite the evidence. Feminists have always contended that medicine was a male-dominated sexist discipline, and they complain that less study was done of female problems than of male problems. But this in fact isn't true. There have been distinct disciplines within medicine of gynecology and obstetrics and children's health that have received a lot of attention, and in fact the great improvements over the last century in longevity for women is to do with those improvements. I just wanted to mention something you may know about. Back in 2015 and in a few years before that, the University of South Australia was planning on setting up a course or a group of courses that they referred to as the New Male Studies. And these were different from male studies or masculinities that were discussed in the gender departments of universities, because they were looking at men's problems from a male perspective. feminists got wind of this and there was a very big vocal backlash. The academics in South Australia who were trying to get this off the ground basically were told that it wasn't going to go ahead. And one good thing that did come out of that is there is a journal called New Male Studies Journal, and if you just Google New Male Studies you'll find it. There are a lot of really good bits of information there. One of the articles in New Male Studies was one by Warren Farrell, where he talks about the gender empathy gap. So we know about this, and other speakers have already mentioned it. But traditional sex roles are changing, and women were given every assistance and opportunity to move out of their traditional sex role into the workforce and to do what they wanted to do. But no such help has been forthcoming for men, who oftentimes will then be at a bit of a loss. And men's traditional views of their gender role or their sex role as providers, protectors, mean that they're loath to admit vulnerability. And this is evident, as was said earlier today in the suicide talk, that men are more likely to manifest, say, depressive symptoms by irritability or aggressiveness or anger than by tearfulness and saying they feel sad. One of the biggest empathy gaps that was addressed by Barry Williams and others earlier is that, and a great frustration for me as a GP, was that when I see patients who are going through issues such as relationship breakdown, family court, child support agency, domestic violence, or being falsely accused of DV, what you find is that there are very few services that I can refer them to that can make any impact on their problems. So I think one of the great steps forward will be when those issues are considered as drivers of health that require attention. And probably we need to start to get those individual emotional narratives of men's stories out there into the public space so that people might start to show a bit of compassion. As I mentioned, there's a service gap between what's available to men and what's available to women, and conventional health services are more geared up to accommodate women and children rather than men. So some men find this off-putting, and there are strategies to get around that are being worked on. A strategy that works really well is to take the healthcare into the workplace. So a lot of companies will have health assessments for their management and executives. A lot of companies will have occupational health requirements that can look at men's underlying concerns as well. There's been programs tested out where people equate men's health to their enjoyment of cars and machinery, so that looking after your health is a bit like servicing your car and keeping everything up to date. And these are all good things that are likely to lead to improvements over time. And there's an action gap. So this male health policy that came out in 2010 indicated that the outcomes they wanted to see were optimal health outcomes for males, health equality between various subpopulation groups, improved health at different age groups, preventative health for males, building a strong evidence base, and improve access to health care for males. Unfortunately, very little has been done to facilitate that. Certainly there's been not any huge increase in funding to try and achieve some of those ideals, and the policy is now 7 years old. However, there are lots of really great people out there doing great work. So probably the epicentre of men's health in Australia is the Western Sydney University. They have a fantastic website, the Men's Health Information Service, which is worth having a look at, headed up by a guy called Professor John McDonald. We have the Australian Male Health Forum, which is the peak health body for men, organising education and health promotion. Andrology Australia is a group that that promote reproductive health for men. The men's shed movement we know about, great thing for older men, not there to provide health services but is often a conduit to older men to seek health advice. And we have grassroots, and at the grassroots, in the people I see on a day-to-day basis, we have families, mothers, fathers, children, uncles, aunts, whatever, and if there's a male health problem, everyone just wants to get in and fix it. Most of them are not aware of the gender politics of the whole issue, and they probably don't need to be. But they do see that things are stacked up against their men. Just to finish, one little example here. This is a lady who lost her husband to melanoma in his 40s. I think she had 3 young boys under the age of 6 or something at that stage. And she went on and created a thing called Danger Sun Overhead. And she's basically spent her life since her husband's death promoting sun protection and skin examinations for guys in the construction industry. Her husband was a foreman on a construction site. So I'll leave it at that.